Hello, this is Dan Ritchie, developer of PD Howler 8, and in this tutorial I would like to go over the new second generation particle tool for drawing foliage. Now this tool is found on the particles panel, and that's here on this context strip. That's the official name for this toolbar across the top. We call that the context strip because it is context sensitive to the tool that you have selected. It'll have different options for whichever tool is selected, but we're going to go ahead and select the paintbrush tool, and over here you'll find the particle button. That brings us to our particle settings. There's particles, bristles, orbicals, and the new foliage tool. You'll get to the foliage by clicking on its tab, and all you have to do is enable it to start working with it. We have a number of presets that you can use. All you have to do is go down here and select the load button at the bottom, and there's a big handful of built-in presets ready to go. But if that's not enough, you can always create your own presets. So I'm going to go over the basics of the panels and all the buttons, starting with the main panel here. As you can see, there's a max particle button, and this basically tells the program the maximum number of particles you want to use. You can set it to a very small number, and you can still draw with it, but you may not have the full effect. And that's basically how many particles are active at any one time. Even with 4 particles, you get some level of complexity. That's because they recycle, but we're going to go ahead and set that back up to a big number, and you can see we'll get more complex results with more particles. This is also dependent on the rules library, how many particles will be emitted per branch and that sort of thing. Now you see here a rule count. This is also dependent on this rules library. I'll go ahead and open this. As you can see, there's a rules panel, and you can select a number of different rules, up to 10 different rules. Each rule represents one branch. So the first rule would represent the first thing that's drawn, which would be, in this case, would be this middle branch right here. And the second rule would represent these branches that start coming off of it. And the third rule would be these additional branches, and the fourth rule would be these ones down here on the end, and there might be a fifth rule and a sixth rule, and so on. And that's basically the logic of that. But as you can see, there's a rule count, and that tells the program how many rules you've defined. You can also use this for testing. You can set it down to 3, for example, just to see the first 3 rules in action, or you can set it up to the full amount. And this is also dependent on what you have set as your final rule. I'll go to the 7th rule, and you can see this rule ends as a split type. There are multiple kinds of split types, but when it ends, that tells the program that you've come to your last branch. But anyways, moving along, you can see there's a max lifespan, and this controls how many steps that will take place to draw this item. And this is a global setting, so this is the maximum lifespan for all of the rules that you have set. So say if I set it to a very small value, you'll just get a small portion of that drawing, or you can set it to a very long value. Let's try 900 and see what happens, and it'll just keep going and keep going until you've reached the end of your rules anyways. This also affects this setting down here called time scale. Time scale will scale the shape of the particles, or these branches that you're drawing, to the amount of their lifespan. That is, the older they get, the smaller they will get. So this max lifespan also controls that. So like I said, if we use a small value, it will scale all the way from the full size down to this little point in that number of steps, that 40 steps or that 80 steps, or whichever you have it set to. Now there's a tint color, a fog color, and some other parameters here. this tint color will multiply a value. It'll take the colors of the branches and multiply it with a value of a color that you set here. So say if you wanted everything to have a red cast to it, you could use this parameter and it'll sort of go into a red color, but it's also dependent on the color of the branches and that sort of thing. You could make it a blue cast, so it won't be fully blue, but it'll have a blue tint to it, or a blue quality to it. And that is also dependent on the color of the branches and that sort of thing that are set in that rules library. Now fog color is different. It will actually, let me reset that tint color. This fog color will actually make an opaque value like a fog. So I'll take like a bluish color, kind of a greenish blue color here, and as you can see there's already a little bit of fog in this setting, but I'm going to change this fog amount up to 100%, and you can see that new color has completely taken over the color of our branches. Or you could set this, you could set this to 50%, and it would be halfway between the original color and this new fog color. And this is useful for having trees in the background that are affected by, say, a sky color or by a atmospheric fog or that sort of thing. And as you move towards the foreground, you could gradually reduce this and use it as sort of a depth cue, because objects in the background would receive more of this fog than the objects in the foreground. So as you move forward, you could add more or take more of that fog out of there, and your objects in the foreground would appear to be closer than those in the background. And that's a very useful feature for doing depth cue and that sort of thing. So moving on, there is also a gain button. It's usually set to 1. Let me turn off these other effects so I can show this how this works. If you set this to 2, for example, you'll get a much brighter quality. Or if you set it, excuse me, I set it to 22 by mistake. You set this to 2, you'll get a much brighter image or drawing. Or if you set it to 0.5, you'll get exactly half excuse me, half the brightness. And that basically controls the amount of brightness or the lightness of these drawings. 0.5 is half, and 2 is double, and that's basically the logic of that. That is another useful feature for varying the amount of color or the amount of intensity of an object to make it more interesting looking and less boring looking. You could, as you draw, you could change this value to get lighter and darker areas, shadow areas, or areas that are out in the bright sunlight, that sort of thing. There's also a pen size. This is a global size, and this is not a pixel value. The pixel values are stored in the rule library. Here, where it says 3.5, that is actually 3.5 pixel width. But this pen size is a multiplier. So whatever you have in that pixel value in that rule will be multiplied by this amount here, this pen size here. So if I had it 10, that would be actually 30 pixels wide, if that, or 35 pixels wide if that were 3.5. And remember, that's also being affected by this time scale. If the time scale wasn't on there, everything would be that same width. Now moving down, we already talked about time scale. There's also a shading option. You can turn shading off, and you'll get a very simple shading model, which is just direct color, which is the combination of the colors that are set in this rule library, the red, green, and blue for each branch, which is also affected by this fog color and this tint color. And that is basically the only shading that happens there. But when you have shading on, there's also a lighting effect that takes place. It is not a simple just top-down lighting, but it is an actual 3D representation of a lighting effect. It uses 3 lights, a bright light, a sort of bluish light, and a sort of fill light. And in the future there might be some additional options for that. We'll eventually be looking into that, I'm sure. And there's also a color cue button here, and what this does is somewhat similar to the fog, except it is using the Z buffer, that's the depth buffer, so that as you draw, let me clear this, let's start with something new. As you draw and let up on that mouse, it will then go back in and reprocess that using the Z buffer. And if you select a color on the tool panel here, say a blue color, I'll use this, just a straight blue, and let me draw something here. And now that I have that blue, you'll see that our Z buffer, as things go further away, they become more blue, and as they come closer, they become less blue. And basically how that works is, as our depth goes from the minimum to the maximum volume of that tree, there's that fog takes over, which is defined by the pen here. You can also use the left and right mouse button drawing as you do normally with a mouse. So you can also draw with white or this blue or whichever colors you have selected there, depending on which mouse button you're using. I'm working with a tablet right now, so I can't really demonstrate that, but you think you get the idea. Let me turn that on. Actually, let me select a more complex tree so I can demonstrate that a little bit better. Let's see, simple tree 5 for example, and I will turn on the depth cue. I'll use that same blue I was using there. As you can see, it draws normally, but when you let up, this becomes a post-process because we basically don't know the full volume of this tree until we're finished drawing it. So as you can see, this is a full 3D effect. There are branches that are further in the background, they get affected more by the fog, and there are branches that are closer to the foreground. And this is fully three-dimensional. It uses a floating point Z buffer to accomplish this. Alright, moving on, there's also an option that says Create Alpha. And this is basically what it sounds like when you draw, an alpha channel is created. Give that a second to update. And now you can see these marching ants around this object. And we can basically do anything we do with an alpha channel in the program. We could use filters that affect just this drawing, for example. But another thing we can do is use the selected as brush, or use this alpha channel that we have as a selection area and select that object as a brush. This becomes a new custom brush. Let me turn this off so we can actually see that. Alright, I am now in the custom brush tool, and this has become a drawing tool basically. I can pick it up and draw with it, and set any number of parameters I want to with that, using, for example, these brush settings and that sort of thing. There's all these brush settings. We've gone over these before. No point to go over it right now, but there's one thing you can do with this Create Alpha button. Now you're probably asking at some point, well, isn't that going to have a white border around it because we were drawing that on white? And the truth is, yes, it will, but we do have a built-in tool under the brush settings, I believe, called Pre-Multiply, which is actually pre-multiply correction, which will eliminate this white border. And basically, since we drew on a white background, we just select white as a color, hit OK, and that actually goes in and removes those white borders, and that becomes a drawing tool that will not have any strange artifacts around it. And you can of course save that as a brush and that sort of thing, or you bring it into your favorite 3D program, for example, as a image map or something to that effect. Okay, that basically wraps up this part of our tutorial. In the next one I'll be covering the rules library, and we'll be back shortly.